So apparently it's KAN-igher instead of KAN-igher. Good thing I definitely knew that before filming literal hours of footage of me saying KAN-igher like a dumb crazy person instead of KAN-igher like it's supposed to be. Including in this upcoming video you're about to watch and in the next like 3 or 4 that I've also already filmed. So that's something to look forward to. Anyway, sorry about how long this video has taken as well. I know it's been a while. Things have been a little bit crazy for me with a whole new job, a whole new place, stuff like that. But I wanted to say that I am very much committed to continuing this series as long as I am able to. And like I said, I already have the next several segments filmed. It's just a matter of editing them, which I do very much want to do. Because as you can probably tell, talking about Wonder Woman is my favorite thing to do in the world, probably. So without further ado, y'all have already waited far too long. Let's just jump right into this video. In issue 158, published in 1965, KAN-igher writes himself into the comic, as he does, and has comic book Robert KAN-igher summon all the colorful cast members of Wonder Woman's comic into his office to deliver some bad news, and also definitely the straightest panel of this series. In a very cheeky, self-referential skit bit, he tells them all that he loves them very much, but has no choice but to retire them. It's like that one episode of Glee where they gathered up all the newer generation cast members that had nonetheless been on the show for 2 years at that point, gave them one scene to say goodbye with, and then we're like, sorry, this ain't working no more, bye, and then we never saw Marley again. Though, hey, in retrospect, that might have led to better things for just about everyone. So, comic book Robert KAN-igher then announces to everyone that from then on they were going to recreate the Golden Age Wonder Woman stories in the current series. Basically, they were going to retell the original canon that was in the 40s and, just act as if KAN-igher's own Silver Age reboot didn't happen and just everything here just takes place in the 40s again, back on Earth 2? So yeah, in the next issue, we see the original Amazon origin again with the original brunette Hippolyta, and we see 40s Diana picking up 40s Steve again for like the 3rd time now, and the contest happens and she takes him back, although there's an extra adventure on an island before they get to America. So it's basically a reboot of the character in some ways, but also an unreboot of the character back to her original boot, with some new adventures thrown into the old canon, and depending on how you look at it, this new old Wonder Woman status quo would last for either about 20 issues till 1968, or roughly 10 issues to 1967. I'll explain that part, but first of all, this is really fucking strange, right? To put it in perspective, it'd be like if DC Comics did one of those universe reboots that they're so notorious for nowadays, but only to one single character, and also set all of this character's stories to take place chronologically 20 years ago. It's gimmicky as hell, and obviously done just to drum up some interest and nostalgia for a series that was clearly starting to lag behind its fellows sales-wise. But how is the execution here? Did it actually improve things? Well, I can't speak for anyone who was actually reading this at the time, but personally, there is something charming and delightful about seeing the old 40s style getting restored for these late 60s stories. Artists Andrew and Esposito really do their utmost to try to recreate H.G. Peters' offbeat, uncanny aesthetic, and I think they make it like 70% there. And something I like about these issues is that all of a sudden, Wonder Woman has a rogues gallery again, which she really just flat out didn't during the previous years. But in bringing back the 40s canon, we get to see the old standbys like Cheetah and Giganta, even Paula von Gunther again, which helps to fill up the pages with stuff other than Diana's love life. KAN-igher seems to take a particular interest in Dr. Psycho and really digs into his psychology and mindset, perhaps even more so than William Marston had. See, that's the funny thing. KAN-igher was writing Marston's characters again, but even after all these years, he still wasn't Marston. I'd almost say that he wrote more like Marston back in 1947 when he first replaced Marston than he does in 1965 trying to recreate Marston's stuff. Either way, as we'll recall, Marston really didn't give much of a hoot about rehabilitating male characters, at least not compared to how much panel space he invested towards rehabilitating his female villains. Something I mostly skipped past in the first video was how Marston dedicated multiple arcs, years worth of stories, towards redeeming Paula von Gunther, for instance, to the point that she pretty much ends up as one of Diana's flagship allies throughout the 40s and beyond. KAN-igher kinda does the opposite here. Characters like Paula and Cheetah and Giganta are little more than generic villains, but there's a really interesting issue where Wonder Woman, tied up with her own lasso as she often is, repeatedly tries to convince Dr. Psycho that even though she feels sorry for him, she doesn't hate him and would genuinely like to be his friend. Psycho, in the meantime, refuses to believe this and repeatedly accuses her of trying to trick him, even though she literally couldn't thanks to the lasso. The story ends tragically with Psycho still unable to accept Wonder Woman's friendship and storming off, but also with the note that it's Diana's job to save everyone in distress, including Dr. Psycho, showing that there's hope for redemption no matter who you are, and oh, hey, it only took 130 issues for KAN-igher to finally remember that Wonder Woman believes in redeeming bad guys with the power of love. I'm pretty sure he only remembered this because he had to reread Marston's old stuff to refresh his memory of the Golden Age, and as we know, Marston was not subtle about this. But that leads us to the main problem of KAN-igher trying to revitalize this book with his big gimmicky tactics over the years, trying to shake up the stale stories that readers had gotten tired of, and that's that at the end of the day, it's still KAN-igher at the wheel, so the guy who's trying to reel you in with the new hotness is the same guy who'd been writing the stuff that had gotten stale with readers in the first place. This starts to be a problem with KAN-igher's Golden Age reboot very early on. Like, within a couple of issues, we're already doing love triangle shit again, which just never makes anyone involved look good, and wasn't this what the reboot was supposed to get rid of in the first place? Why did we have to go back to the 40s just to have more romance drama? And then, without the Fishman and the Birdman to bounce off of anymore, Steve Trevor really gets the brunt of being a major asshole in some of these issues for the sake of conflict. There's one issue in particular, issue 167, where Steve realizes that Wonder Woman has to obey anyone who ties her up with her lasso, because yes, KAN-igher finally remembered that this was one of its powers, and now he can't stop tying Diana up just like Marston used to. Anyway, and so Steve throws the lasso around her to force her to marry him, despite her pleading with him to let her go. According to Steve, "I don't want to wait any longer. No one can blame me. You're irresistible." So, this is attempted rape. In retrospect, it's almost kind of surprising that it took this long for the lasso to be used this way. I think we should all be grateful that Marston had more tact than to do so, and that KAN-igher had forgotten about the lasso's powers for most of his tenure up until now. Thankfully, the issue ends with Steve letting go of the lasso in a fight with some crooks. Wonder Woman lectures him about it a bit, and we cap it off with some jokes and smiles, and we'll never talk about this ever again. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of the asshole love interest dynamic, but maybe I'm not the right person to ask about this, because this whole shtick has been somewhat ubiquitous in media, having a very robust history all the way back to Regency romance and, like, Shakespeare or whatever. So, clearly all this must have appealed to someone. Having said that though, contradictorily, I also think that having a bit more time to spend with just Steve and Diana, without the motley crew of animal men and alternate selves hogging focus, does give us a bit of space to actually appreciate their unapologetically quirky, train-wrecky dynamic. Especially later on in this run, there's a stretch of like 2 or 3 issues where it's almost as if KAN-igher had given up the pretense a bit and just let these two be openly loving and flirtatious with each other without the back and forth unrequited drama of it all. And it's like, hey, I actually like these characters. Why couldn't we have had this shit for the last 20 years? So other than the return of Wonder Woman's rogues gallery and Steve Trevor's reemergence as the de facto leading man of Diana's life, which immediately went to his head, Did anything else actually change in this reboot? Well, not really. This was still just a KAN-igher Wonder Woman series, just like it has been for 20 years, and you kinda knew by now what to expect. We still can't find Etta Candy and the Holiday Girls anywhere, and despite this all ostensibly technically taking place in World War II, that conceit ended up getting dropped like almost immediately. I don't know if this was a code thing or not, or maybe KAN-igher just still didn't want the book to feel too dated, but either way, we never see any Nazi soldiers for Diana to fight other than in a brief appearance in the origin flashback. This isn't to say that she and Steve didn't fight enemy soldiers a lot, they're just referred to as more generic spies and enemy forces as opposed to any real national thing. Regardless of how timeless KAN-igher might have maybe wanted these stories to feel, there are a lot more things here that will still end up making these books feel dated to the late 60s and early 70s. In issue 164, the enemy spy Angle Man manages to tie Wonder Woman up, as you do, and forces her to steal American weapons for him. Steve makes a very big fuss about how this is treason, and how doing this will make Wonder Woman a traitor, and basically spends the whole issue really hammering in how vile and irredeemable she would be if she does this. Man, I didn't think Steve even had any opinions about anything else other than Wonder Woman, and here he is declaring that he'll hate her forever for being a traitor to her country, no matter the reason, and just overall laying it very thick that the absolute worst thing that anyone can do in the history of anything is to betray America to the enemy. I wonder what was happening in the world at this time that would compel KAN-igher to write this sort of absolutist patriotism in this book, just angrily railing against the very possibility of anyone betraying America to an enemy country. Oh yeah, this was happening. Ugh. I wonder if this is going to have any long-term impact on the state of the world, maybe even leading to some major tragic events as I speak. So yeah, the whole rewinding to the Golden Age thing didn't really happen so much. A few issues into the reboot, and it really didn't matter that there had been a reboot at all. Any of these stories could have taken place during any time or canon. In issue 166, we meet up again with Egg Fu, who is a character that KAN-igher himself created not so long ago before this big revamp. In issue 168, we catch up with Queen Hippolyta, but she's blonde again like she was in KAN-igher's Earth 1 reboot. Are we back on Earth 1 now? I think she's supposed to be drawn as her 40s Earth 2 brunette self, because you can see that the crown and the hairdo are modeled after Golden Age Hippolyta, but there might have been a colorist mistake, like someone just forgot that this was supposed to take place back in the Golden Age, and who could blame them? It really hadn't made much difference to anything for a while. We'll see Hippolyta again in 2 issues, and yep, she's just blonde again now, and even sporting her Silver Age style and crown, so I guess we're just running with it. That's why I said it's really not clear how long this Golden Age reboot actually lasted. Technically, KAN-igher would go on to write about 10 more issues, but I think we're just supposed to be, like, back with Silver Age Diana at this point. And yep, you heard me right. KAN-igher's 2-decade tenure on Wonder Woman is coming to an end. Mostly, kind of. And there wasn't exactly a big commotion about it. One issue he was writing the book, and the next issue he wasn't. It's possible that he simply got tired of writing this book after all this time. After all, 20 years is a lot to dedicate to a series, no matter how attached you might be to it. But it's also likely, or perhaps serendipitous, that DC was probably looking at this point to do a for realsies actual no bullshit full slate revamp of the character in a way that hadn't been done to her before or anyone else. And indeed, that was what would come to pass as we are about to enter the notorious mod years. Fans nowadays also tend to refer to this whole period as the Secret Agent Diana Prince era, but I think that's a bit misleading. The whole thing definitely drew a lot of inspiration from the spy genre, and Diana sort of acted like a world-trotting super spy sometimes, but she was never actually employed by any government agency at this time, which kind of feels like an important requisite for being a secret agent, and mostly she just went around on her own with a couple of civilian friends. Kinda ironic that Wonder Woman would only become remembered as a secret agent at the time when she literally stopped being employed by the military, but them's how it is. So this whole experiment, for lack of a better word, for better or for worse, will end up becoming one of those hallmark-defining segments of Wonder Woman history and DC Comics itself. There's only one thing that most casual fans know about Wonder Woman in the Silver Age. It's probably that DC once took away her superpowers, put her in some admittedly groovy clothes, and had her go on street-level martial arts spy adventures with this guy I Ching. And let's go ahead and point out that the reason it remains so memorable to this day is probably because the whole concept is just patently ridiculous and bizarre and drew a lot of mockery from a lot of sides. Which just goes to show the unfortunate maxim that no one really pays attention to all the years of good stuff you put out that weren't dumb gimmicks, but your most outrageous missteps are the ones that get instantly immortalized. But that was kind of the point, wasn't it? Sales were waning again, no one was paying notice. Wonder Woman as a concept was lagging behind many of the other DC properties that had been maturing with times, and oh Jesus, what the hell was happening over here? Oh god, oh no! So you pull out the stops, you make the big changes, you make the memorable choices that will cause the most fuss. The fact that this was controversial and got people talking was a feature of this rollout, not a bug. But the talk that people talked about this may not have been the talk that DC Comics wanted people to talk exactly. In particular, in 1972, renowned feminist activist Gloria Steinem put the iconic Wonder Woman on the cover of the first independent issue of Ms. magazine and talked about all the good stuff that the character used to represent to her and to other women, and criticized DC for depowering Wonder Woman, seeing it as a form of disempowerment. It's hard for us today to imagine a single article in a single magazine really causing that much of a fuss to anyone, what with the 1,000 billion talking points and news bites coming at us every day from every corner of the world. But DC did end up restoring Wonder Woman's powers and costume in 1973, less than a year after the article had come out. And it's one of those things where we can't really be sure if it was done directly because of the controversy stirred up by Ms. Magazine, or if the article just ended up being a convenient excuse for DC to revert the change that they were never completely married to in the first place. So let's go ahead and talk about this. This whole mod era for Wonder Woman could certainly be called many things. Gimmicky, a big change, kinda dated, etc. But was it actually offensive? Was it anti-feminist? Let me say in advance that, in my opinion, having read them recently, these issues of Wonder Woman starring the depowered, snazzy, outfitted Diana Prince were not terrible as comics. I know, such ringing endorsement, right? But let's remember that the bar had not been set super duper high for poor Wonder Woman around this time anyway. Making this book completely different from what it used to be was, let's face it, probably doing the series a big service. And the mod era was undoubtedly very, very different from what came before, and probably very different from the impression that you have of it today. And it's certainly got its share of weird foibles that new and experimental stories are usually filled with, which we'll get into in more detail. But it's also just, like, it's okay as a comic book. We got a hero, they encounter some problems, they go around handling these problems. It ain't masterpiece theater, but it does its job. I'd said this about KAN-igher, and I'll say it here. A lot of these Silver Age things will come across dated and train wrecky to us, but no one sets out to deliberately write a bad comic book. So the question here isn't about whether the writing itself was god-awful, but whether the idea here that was being written about in and of itself was somehow just intrinsically bad. We're asking here if a story can be technically executed fine on a technical level, but still just somehow come across as wrong. Specifically in this case, the question is whether it was somehow demeaning and sexist and anti-progressive for DC Comics to have taken away Wonder Woman's superpowers and costume and gear and just turned her into a regular woman for years and years of comic books, albeit someone who could still throw down and fight crime with some newfound martial arts. And the answer is, yeah, kinda it was. Look, For this kind of stuff, I always refer back to that age-old litmus test of, would this happen to a male character? And the answer I always end up with is no. We can see that what happened to Wonder Woman here factually, objectively, did not happen to any other male characters back then, and would still not happen now. The closest example I can think of is Superman receiving a large power downgrade during the New 52, but even then he still had some powers and still went around calling himself Superman and still had a version of his costume, even if it was store-bought, and the whole thing lasted less than 2 years, during which there was also another fully powered Superman flying around anyway. Long story. Let's be clear, comic book characters have their powers messed with all the time. It's one of those archetypal rites of passage for a superhero, like fighting an evil twin or finding out that your best friend is secretly evil or whatever. But it was usually a temporary one-off thing. It was a problem that a character would face and subsequently overcome, and this act of reclaiming their full powers, of them finding a way around the power downgrade they were afflicted with, would be treated as something figuratively empowering on top of being literally so. The idea of completely stripping away a character's identity and superpowers in the long term as the persistent status quo that they would just have to live with, like, remember that no one knew at the time if Diana would ever get her powers back. Now, obviously, if this sort of story happened today, we'd be all like, oh, clearly this is just a temporary gimmick. It might take a while, but the old iconic Wonder Woman would come back eventually. But for all that readers knew back in the day, this was just how it would be forever from here on out. In any case, this just didn't happen to other characters, and the fact that it ended up happening to Wonder Woman deserves a bit of critical scrutiny. Yeah, her sales were lagging, but other characters' sales have lagged before as well, and no one's ever said, well, what if the Flash just wasn't fast anymore? Maybe readers would like him more if he wasn't fast. Like, DC would literally retire a character whose sales were low and replace them with a whole new person before actually depowering this character. Thematically, the writing on the wall has always been that a character getting depowered is kind of a bad thing that they should try to get better from, but here they're telling readers to see this as an awesome, great thing that we should be glad was happening to Wonder Woman, which is just very silly. So did this happen, consciously or otherwise, because this was a female character? I mean, it obviously hadn't happened to the male characters, but was that because they weren't Wonder Woman, or more so because they weren't women? And my answer to that question would be that it doesn't really matter. DC still screwed over the female characters of their company by this decision, whether they intended to or not. When you only have the one single comic series that stars a female superhero, like it or not, how you treat and how you portray that one single leading woman in all of your company is going to be very representative of how your company treats its female characters overall. Remember that characters like Supergirl and Batgirl didn't actually have books at this point. They were still supporting characters in their male counterparts' books. So the only other female-led series on the shelves at this point was Superman's girlfriend, Lois Lane. And I love Lois, but she's not so much a superhero here. When Wonder Woman is your one and only female superhero with a solo series, and then you take away Wonder Woman's powers, congratulations, you have depowered 100% of your visible leading female superheroes, which is kinda shitty. Like, I'm sorry, you're the one who established this ratio. This is just how it appears. Even irrespective of these cold, flat numbers, I would argue that there's just something inherently gendered and patronizing about this particular trope of basically paring down a character's abilities in order to make them better, more relatable than they were before, especially in the many ways that this trope tends to get applied towards female characters. I know I said that being literally powerful doesn't make a character well written, but that doesn't mean that the reverse is true and that the secret recipe to getting Wonder Woman was to make her weaker. Like, oh, sorry, we just didn't like you all that much when you were super strong, but you sure are much more likable now that you're not. I personally find it especially annoying when it's suggested that a character's incredible OP powers were simply holding them back from their true potential somehow. Marvel did this recently with Jean Grey, where they try to make it so that the cosmic force of life and death that she was hosting within herself was actually preventing her from being as powerful a mutant as she could be without it, so she should be glad that we won't let her be Phoenix anymore. No, I'm pretty sure she was just more powerful as the Phoenix. Like, that's just kind of how it works. I know the Fox Phoenix movies were bad, but that's not an excuse to take it out on the comics character. And I just keep coming back to the inference that this would never happen to male characters. Male characters getting depowered is played as an inconvenience, a conflict, or a hurdle to surmount, or even sometimes as a comedy. It can be entertaining to see Goku, for instance, dealing with temporary power downgrades every once in a while, but no one would ever say that Goku didn't work as a character because he was so crazy powerful. They just wouldn't. And I can absolutely see where writers don't mean at all for this sort of thing to feel demeaning towards female characters. On the contrary, I think that they think of female characters going around kicking ass without their powers as something empowering and flattering. Like, this character is so cool, she doesn't even need enhanced strength and speed to take on bad guys, or like, being able to hold her own even without her powers proves just how much more capable she is than everyone else. And sure, it is always fun to see characters find ways to throw down and succeed on that level. But that begs the question of why Wonder Woman and other characters like her should ever even have to prove themselves like that. Who was questioning their capabilities in the first place, and why would they? I think this is why this scene here, you know this scene, struck such a chord with so many audience members, along with striking a nerve with some others. Now, what's his name here was obviously just making a last-ditch attempt to goad Carol into a battle she'll actually lose, but asking for women to minimalize themselves in order to prove some kind of point about how competent they actually are, it's gonna feel abrasive even if done with the best of intentions. Again, I cannot speak for women, but I understand that this feeling of constantly having to prove your worth and establish your capabilities and re-establish them again and again for everyone in ways that would never be asked of men, while knowing that you are just as capable as them, or God forbid, just flat out far more qualified to do this job than anyone else in the room, that is a very pervasive experience that a lot of women go through. So I know that DC felt like they were elevating Diana by having her become a very kick-ass hero even without her superpowers, but it's also just kinda really irritating. Yes, characters that can kick ass without heightened powers are cool, and those characters are right there for you to highlight if you want to see that. I know you thought Emma Peel was cool, but you don't need to make Wonder Woman into Emma Peel. I know Batman is cool. Doesn't mean I want to see Superman turned into Batman. And then, on top of everything else, they also threw in this whole shtick with Diana updating her wardrobe to the radical modern style. Again, obviously, I know they were trying to make her hip and cool because her sales weren't great, but still, it just comes across as DC going, hey, women like fashion, right? Wonder Woman is a woman? Let's make her really into fashion. Well, good job, guys. You did it. You fixed Wonder Woman. I do want to be clear here. When I talk about this sort of story being bad, I'm not talking about the quality of the story exactly. A lot of stories about depowering or disempowering female characters have been bad, yes, and a lot of them have been pretty damn impressive. And yes, that includes many of my own favorites. But when there is such a gender disparity with one trope or another, we have to be able to see that it is a shitty trope even if you write it well. And it's certainly up for debate whether they wrote this specific instance well. Well, whatever else might have been the case, we certainly can't fault DC for skimping on the talent. The new writer on Wonder Woman was Dennis O'Neil, whom you might know as the guy who had Green Lantern and Green Arrow go on their road trip and got Speedy addicted to heroin. On artwork, we got Mike Sekowsky, who had previously worked on Justice League of America. From what I can tell, this whole depowered Diana Prince era was both of their brainchild, but not exactly in the usual collaborative way. At the time, Sekowsky had already been working on a new female character who he thought readers would relate to more, and when he was brought on to work on Wonder Woman, O'Neil more or less just incorporated those ideas onto this title. So this kind of really was just DC creating a whole new character and calling her Wonder Woman, or at least appending all of this new unrelated character's traits onto Wonder Woman. Strangely, O'Neill ended up helming only 5 issues of this story before leaving Sekowsky alone on the title as writer, editor, artist. Which, okay. O'Neill has since gone on record to say that, as expected, he was really only trying to make Wonder Woman into an even more empowered and relatable character than she was. Although he does understand in retrospect why people had problems with this. So, call it a lesson learned. As I said, the series was never outright terrible or anything during this time. It was Emma Peel. It was just flat out Diana Rigg as Emma Peel from the Avengers TV show, and they were not subtle about it. The general gist of the story that I am very much abbreviating here is that Steve Trevor is getting into some shenanigans, and for plot reasons, Wonder Woman can only help him as Diana Prince, and even then only as a hip, modern, fashionable version of Diana Prince who knows all the ins and outs of the seedy, modern, street-level underbelly things like clubs and dancing. It's very obviously a look what I can do in my cool, radical Diana identity that I couldn't do as my lame, older costume self sort of setup. So she helps out Steve, but then in the very next issue he gets into even more trouble. And in the meantime, Hippolyta and the Amazons are like, hey Diana, we all of a sudden have to do our totally normal, regularly scheduled thing all of a sudden, where we leave this dimension to go recharge our mystic mojo in another dimension for an indeterminate amount of time. You want to come with or nah? And if you don't, you'll lose your powers. Sorry. So, right off the bat, this is weird because, as you'll recall, in the Golden Age, Diana got her powers from Amazon training, not Amazon magic. The whole point was that anyone could be like Wonder Woman if they trained like she did, even if they were a human woman. So the Amazon's magic going away shouldn't make Diana any weaker. And then, in the Silver Age, the gods blessed Diana with powers at birth. So this power comes from the gods and is still not contingent on the Amazons being around. So essentially, we got a writer on Wonder Woman who doesn't seem to actually know Wonder Woman that well, who's taking away her powers, but didn't really remember how she was powered in the first place. Starting off strong, we are. Diana ends up choosing to stay because, according to her, Steve needs her help more than ever. No one mentions anything about the whole mission to help the world that she had. Diana very specifically chooses to stay for Steve, which, in fairness, is at least pretty in character for her. So in roughly 2 pages, Diana has chosen to forsake her home and heritage forever. Oh my god, how is her ankle bending that way? Jesus god, that's painful just to look at. Anyway, she gets back to the States and realizes that she suddenly has to deal with very practical human problems like money and food and housing and... Hold on a second, I'm already calling bullshit here again. Does Denny O'Neil believe that Wonder Woman didn't, eat or live anywhere before now? I know that KAN-igher's run was often very weird and surrealistic, but it's always been very clear, even then, that Diana had a job and her own apartment, and so she wasn't, depending on her Amazon superpowers to subsist or whatever. Diana Prince worked in military intelligence for years. Whatever practical problems she might not have faced before, it can't be that she's never had a steady career and source of income. Why is she poor now? Where did her existing apartment go? Did she quit her secretary job off-panel? And if so, why? Take another mental bookmark here, dear viewers, because we're once again coming across one of those persistent issues that will start to pop up again and again as different writers take on Wonder Woman over the years. See, one of the big problems of the Wonder Woman title is that its problems tend to repeat themselves. We're already seeing signs, even now in the late 60s, that, well, to put it bluntly, DC never seems to learn from their mistakes when it comes to Diana. The missteps made by one writer might get made again and again by future writers. You might see some story do something very glaringly silly and problematic, only to find out that it had already been done many times over in previous stories. You really don't fully grasp how cyclical and recurring that comic book writers can be with their ideas till you've seen the same irritating trends pop up again for the 6th or 7th time in different hands. In this case, what I'm talking about, of course, is this tendency for certain writers to see Diana as very inhuman and unrelatable for some reason, and to thereby try to forcibly humanize her in ways that she really probably didn't need. Denny O'Neil is likely the first writer, but he will not be the last, to see the classic Wonder Woman character as someone very aloof and godlike, who just doesn't understand what it's like to be a mortal human woman who needs to step down from the clouds to dirty her hands with ordinary human concerns so that she can truly grow into a good character. We will see this again and again. This is the conflict that writers like O'Neil have envisioned for Diana, and all these stories of theirs are meant to finally resolve this conflict for Diana for the first time. Each and every one of these writers will be the ones to show Wonder Woman what it really means to be human just like everyone else. And I guess this isn't a god-awful story concept in theory, because the seeds of it are technically baked into the character. Wonder Woman's general origin arc is that she comes from a very different place than the average person, and so learning how the average person lives is just inherently going to be kind of a natural aspect of her overall fish out of water journey. We see lots of this in the 2017 film, obviously, and in other such similar, not terrible interpretations of Diana, so I, in theory, do understand why O'Neil and other writers write these stories of Diana, not really understanding what it's like to be an average human person, and I don't hold that against them. The problem is that the story still has to make sense. Sure, Diana might be stymied by things like jobs and money if she just stepped off the plane from Paradise Island 5 minutes ago, but it's silly to treat her as some out-of-touch goddess when she's been living here for years with friends and co-workers and her own room and board and whatnot. At that point, you're not actually writing about Diana. Instead, you've invented a brand new character that would actually have these problems and put her into Diana's place. I guess it's kind of a moot point anyway, because in the very next panel, after Diana worries about, in her words, being poor, she comes across an apartment and storefront for rent and just, gets it, and talks about turning it into a small business. With what money, Diana? You just said you didn't have any. In any case, Diana will end up turning this spot into a boutique store called Modely Modern. Now, in case you're assuming that O'Neil is using this setup to actually show us Diana learning the ins and outs of normal human matters like running a small business and dealing with rent, like, sometimes we see Spider-Man dealing with that kind of stuff. Well, rest assured that she basically opens this place off-panel, and it's really not ever explained how she actually runs it. Listen, full disclosure, I used to co-own a storefront, and I wish I could have opened it off-panel. Before we tackle those issues, though, Diana sees an old blind man being attacked by hoodlums outside her new place. The man ends up kicking their asses, telling Diana that he knows she used to be Wonder Woman. Somehow. I don't think this ever gets explained. I mean, normally I'd say anyone would be able to tell that Diana used to be Wonder Woman, considering that they have the same face and Diana doesn't even wear glasses anymore. But this guy is blind, so let's move on. His name is I Ching, and he comes from an ancient sect hidden in the mountains, but it got destroyed by some villain named Dr. Cyber, who just so happens to be the bad guy that Steve Trevor is after. And so I Ching is here to train Diana so that she can defeat Dr. Cyber without her Amazon powers. Oh, I have to talk about I Ching, don't I? I have to, have an opinion on him? I, as me, Brian, a Chinese-American comic book reader, have to do the discourse on this character who is an old blind mystical martial arts master who lived in a temple, speaks in proverbs, and mentors our white hero about stuff. What do I think about I Ching? He's fine. It's fine. The wise old martial arts master is obviously a bit of a dated trope, but it's also not as if Asian media didn't have our own versions of this kind of thing, so really, when it comes to a straightforward racial stereotype like this, which cartwheels on that fine line between representation and caricature, it's less about the concept itself and more about the execution, which is not, terrible here or anything. Could have been better, could have been worse. At bare minimum, he's depicted as a pretty helpful character with his own goals and personality, and I believe we are meant to appreciate his presence here just as Diana does. He comes across as a worldly, knowledgeable father figure with friends and contacts all over the place, to contrast against a very wide-eyed Diana who mostly follows his leads. Compared to like Egg Foo just a couple years back, I-Ching's fine. He would eventually even become a pretty great character in the 2016 new Superman series by Jean Lin Yang, which just goes to show that, again, it's all about the execution more than the concept. So then I-Ching trains Diana for a few months in... in karate? Oh, for fuck's sake, I just said you were doing fine. Yes, obviously anyone can know karate, and a lot of Chinese people probably do practice karate, but karate is a Japanese martial art, and I kinda feel like O'Neill just didn't think that deeply about it here, and so just ended up having the Chinese guy with the Chinese name teaching Japanese martial arts here because it's all Asian. Anyway, Steve Trevor then rudely interrupts their important Asian lessons by being shot and getting sent to the hospital, though not before putting a new quest marker on Diana's map so she can go and show off her fancy new skills. Cool! Anyway, Steve dies in the next issue. Bye, Steve! O'Neill himself takes full responsibility for killing Steve off, partly because he just didn't like the character much, thought he was dull. Which, sure, I get it. The way Steve was written under KAN-igher, even at his occasional best, he was unlikely to be anyone's favorite character. But still, this character's been around since 1942. He is Wonder Woman's equivalent of Lois Lane, whether you like it or not. And this here is a very ignoble way to unceremoniously gun him down. I will remember you. We're also seeing the emergence of yet another one of the persistent problems that will keep on popping up again and again in the Wonder Woman series as writers keep reinventing and reimagining her stories over the coming years. O'Neill is just speed running through these at this point. On top of interpreting Diana as an inhuman figure, he's also completely shuffled out her supporting cast and replaced them with his own creations. Even KAN-igher didn't retire Etta Candy this quickly, this completely. I know that it is a revamp. I know that the whole point is that the old thing wasn't working. The whole point is to replace it entirely. But, man, knowing what I know about the ways that writers will tackle Wonder Woman through the years, I know that this scorched earth approach of tossing out every single recognizable thing about her mythos in order to highlight each new writer's own special unique additions to the canon, this is really going to hurt Wonder Woman stories and identity over the years. In this case, it particularly didn't help that O'Neill's special unique additions to the mythos aren't really anything to sing about. We got I-Ching, who's like, okay, if you're into that kind of thing, and then Diana quickly runs into and allies with Tim Trench, a private detective that's also trying to stop Dr. Cyber for reasons. The very first thing we ever learn about this character is that he unironically named his gun Lulu, which tells us everything we'd ever want or need to learn about him. He is essentially every single hard-boiled manly detective stereotype rolled together into a person, and therefore utterly forgettable. I'm literally reading his wiki entries as we speak, and I've already forgotten all of it. Let's move on. O'Neill did also come up with the nefarious villain mastermind Dr. Cyber, who we soon learn is actually a woman. I believe it's supposed to be a cool, shocking twist that someone who was built up as such a nefarious villain off-panel, who committed such atrocities off-panel, wreaked such havoc off-panel, had so many people trying to stop them off-panel, turned out to be a woman. But honestly, female villains had been a pretty common staple of the Wonder Woman series ever since the beginning, so this particular twist really wasn't all that notable. William Moulton Marston used to cut his teeth on hordes after hordes of lethal ladies for Diana to contend with, none of whom O'Neill are using here, so, you know, good thing we're revamping everything just to do what's already been done. The only really big changes here are in the genre and tone. Dr. Cyber doesn't exactly do anything particularly cybernetic as far as I can tell, but she serves a decent enough role as a Bond villain archetype who's got their criminal operations and secret base and, evil attack falcons? The point being, the genre and tone of Wonder Woman's stories are changing a lot here, so it makes sense for her new foes to represent this kind of new spy-based, globe-trotting, adventure-based mastermind villain. And on that note, Dennis O'Neil goes on to leave the book. So yeah, this guy came aboard, completely turned everything about Wonder Woman on its head, instigated a wholly mind-bogglingly drastic new status quo for the character, and then just dipped out after 4 issues, leaving artist Mike Sekowsky to do, well, pretty much everything on his own. I don't know what the behind-the-scenes rationale was for any of this. Maybe this was always the plan, but it certainly looks a bit weird from our modern understanding of comic book runs. Like, nowadays you generally don't hop onto a series to do a complete top-down deconstructive revamp and then hit the road 5 minutes later to leave other people to clean up your mess. Oh wait, unless you do in fact literally do that. What's funny is that immediately after O'Neil left, Sekowsky took a big break from the status quo we literally just finished setting up and sent Diana right back to Paradise Island to do a massive sword and sorcery adventure with the Amazons and gods and Siegfried and the Valkyries. It wasn't a bad story, it's just funny that we made this whole big fuss about Diana having to leave the Amazons and her old super-powered life and all her mystical stuff. And then a couple issues later, both she and I Ching are here in horseback and armor, and you mean to tell me we could have done this the whole time? Shit, y'all, why couldn't we have made this the revamp? A slight thing of note here is that in this story, Ares refers to Hippolyta as his daughter and Diana as his granddaughter. Small mythological sidebar. This is drawn from real-world Greek mythology, where Hippolyta is the daughter of Ares, and obviously contradicts pre-existing DC Comics canon, which is not the same thing. As much as Sekowsky apparently liked the DC Amazons well enough to revisit them pretty much immediately, he simply didn't know their comics lore all that well, which is too bad. I don't think this familial connection between Ares and Hippolyta ever gets referenced again after Sekowsky's run on this series, at least not until John Byrne takes on the book way later in the 90s, so I think we can chalk it up as a simple mistake on Sekowsky's part, by which I mean the guy picked up an actual mythology book and put in the actual historical mythology. Either way though, if you're as obsessive about keeping track of Wonder Woman's origins as I am, we got this one story here where she was Ares' granddaughter. Sekowsky will headline this series for 16 issues until 1972, which sounds like a pretty decent run until you realize that at least a couple of these issues are essentially just reprints of older issues. Issue 191 reprints 179, and issues 197 and 198 reprint issues 181 through 183. Yeah, I don't know what was going on behind the scenes here, because this was not a common thing on the series before now. As to what the series was actually like around this time, well, it was honestly pretty wild and schizophrenic, even by this book's standards. Diana fights some weirdos who are kidnapping runaway kids, she fights Morgan Le Fay's daughter who turned one of those kids' boyfriends into a frog, she and a friend put on Yellowface to sneak into communist China in order to help out I Ching. Yikes. And we take yet another detour into a sword and sorcery fantasy world to do some Arthurian stuff, and then I'm bored, guys. Is anyone else bored? I think I'm bored. I still don't think these issues are all that bad in and of themselves, but they don't really have anything interesting to say about Wonder Woman. Not the character she was before the revamp, nor the character that she will become in the years going forward. Dennis O'Neil jumps back onto the series with issue 199 and sticks around for just 3 issues this time, before being replaced by Samuel R. Delaney for the remaining 2 issues of the mod era. Again, your guess is as good as mine as to what was going on behind the scenes with all these production road bumps. A safe assumption might be that DC themselves were getting pretty bored of the unpowered Diana Prince status quo, and were just dragging their feet before finding the right time to reinstate the iconic Wonder Woman again. See, around this time they were reprinting some of Wonder Girl's old wacky adventures from the KAN-igher years at the tail end of issues, presumably to prepare audiences for a return to the classic adventures. In any case, O'Neil's 3-issue return to the book was also fairly unremarkable. The only particularly notable parts about it were him wrapping up any loose ends with Dr. Cyber, by which I mean he kills her off, and also him bringing in Catwoman for a short adventure, which, as far as I can tell, is actually one of the first times that Wonder Woman had crossed over with another significant DC character in her own book. You'd think it would have happened more times in the past 30 years, but no, apparently it just hadn't until now. Samuel R. Delany is a fairly prolific science fiction author, but a pretty obscure comic book writer. He was originally supposed to write a 6-issue arc on this book that would culminate in a battle over an abortion clinic. Presumably with Diana on the side of the abortion clinic. Delany seemed to be establishing pretty coherent scenes for this story, setting up a notably feminist tone with what little he got to write here. Oh look, catcalling was fucking annoying for women even back 50 years ago. And even billing the issue as a special women's lib issue. Which makes it a little bit ironic that, as I mentioned earlier, Gloria Steinem was calling out DC at the time for depowering Wonder Woman, which led to Delany's planned feminist story to be cancelled and for Wonder Woman to return to her costumed identity just 1 issue later. And who better to return Wonder Woman to her iconic OP self than the one, the only, you know him, you love him, Robert KAN-igher. He's back, fuckers. Oh, you thought you were free, Robert, and so did we, but none of us will ever be free. And the very first thing KAN-igher does upon returning to the book is to kill off I Ching in a hail of bullets. Oh, really, man? Come on. I guess turnabout is fair play, but I really wish writers wouldn't just kill off characters that they have no use for. I will remember you. Wouldn't it have been fun, for instance, to see I Ching getting to interact with a fully powered Wonder Woman? Diana then fights off the sniper, falls from a building, loses all her memories, feels compelled by forces she can't understand to fly to Paradise Island, which is also just unexplainably back now, and gets hooked up to an Amazon memory machine that retells her, and us, the classic Wonder Woman origin story with the whole Ares and Aphrodite thing, Hercules tricking Hippolyta, Diana being made from clay and given the power of the gods, and all of it with the slightly more graphic, violent tone that you wouldn't have found in the 60s family-oriented KAN-igher stories. KAN-igher might be back, but times have changed a little bit. Wonder Woman has become a little tiny bit more of an adult book, even if it took a couple writers to drag it kicking and screaming to this point. And with that, we are officially done with the mod era. I maintain that the stories weren't god-awful, and it's not that there wasn't good material in here. It's more that the good material couldn't save the overall situation, which I will describe again as being pretty schizophrenic. It was a hard sell in the first place, and DC didn't exactly step up to meet their own challenge. You do a complete sudden revamp of the book that upends its genre and tone, but you're also constantly revamping the revamp every couple of issues. For a period of Wonder Woman canon that's been largely and somewhat inaccurately remembered as the Spy Era, we actually took not just one, not just two, but 3 whole trips into alternate fantasy dimensions. Couldn't most of that have been done with the classic Wonder Woman? And that was the least of the problems here. Ultimately, the whole situation was a gimmick, and DC probably didn't think much about its implementation beyond just having a gimmick to boost sales, and it showed both in the pages and behind the scenes. Still, it's another one of those Silver Age things that happened long enough ago that we can look back on it now from our hyper-advanced modern vantage point and see a lot of the tacky charm of it all, in very distant retrospect. This is comic books. Tacky, train-wrecky things happen all the time throughout the very long history that we're covering. The important thing is to learn from these mistakes so that you definitely never ever do the same kind of cringy, self-sabotaging thing that you did before, right? Definitely never again.